June 24th, 2009. Away from the stadium crowds and camera flashes, Neverland Ranch was quiet. Inside, 13-year-old Jaafar Jackson was sitting alone with his uncle, Michael. There was an exhaustion in Michael's face that Jaafar couldn't quite name. Michael pulled out a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, secured with a combination lock. It was unadorned and serious. When Jaafar reached out to take it, Michael pulled the box back. He told his nephew he wasn't ready for it. He laid out a specific rule. Jaafar was not to open the lock for exactly 10 years, until June 25th, 2019. Michael handed over a slip of paper with the combination and shared a final embrace. "You'll understand when you open it," he whispered. "I love you, Jeff, more than you know." This private exchange set a 10-year clock in motion, starting hours before the world Jaafar knew collapsed. The next afternoon, Jaafar was in his bedroom when his mother's phone began to buzz. She ran into his room, unable to speak. Her hands were trembling as she grabbed the television remote. The screen filled with breaking news banners. Paramedics were at Michael's home following a cardiac arrest. At 2:44 p.m., the news anchor's voice dropped. Michael Jackson was dead, at 50 years old. Jaafar struggled to reconcile the global broadcast with the memory of the hug shared just the day before. He ran to his closet. The locked metal box sat exactly where he had left it, the folded combination paper resting beside it. The temptation to open it was immediate. While the world watched the news, he needed the final message he knew was waiting inside. He reached out, then stopped. He remembered his uncle's voice. "Promise me, Jaafar. 10 years, no matter what happens." A private gift had become a test of discipline, beginning on the first day of grief. By July 7th, the focus shifted to the Staples Center. Millions watched on television as the family stood over a gold casket. Outside, the crowds were immense. The world was processing the loss through a massive media spectacle. Inside the arena, sitting with his family, Jaafar was carrying a secret. As the ceremony concluded and the casket was closed, Jaafar leaned forward. Under the noise of the stadium, he whispered a private vow. "I kept my promise, Uncle Mike. I'll wait." While the world used the broadcast to say a final goodbye, Jaafar's own process was only beginning. This timeline marks a 10-year gap between a promise and its deadline. As Jaafar grew from a teenager into an adult, the locked box remained in his closet, untouched. He maintained that boundary through a decade of headlines and public scrutiny regarding his uncle's legacy. Now, 10 years later, he stands in his bedroom holding the box. His hands shake as he prepares to enter the combination. Standing there, the contents of the box are defined by the 10 years of silence required to reach this moment. The wait lasted through 3,652 days of news cycles and public mourning. Holding the box until 2019, Jaafar maintained a connection built on a promise kept in private. In June 2009, the world stopped. A global icon had died suddenly, and the media reaction was immediate and overwhelming. But away from the cameras and the crowds, 14-year-old Jaafar Jackson was dealing with a much quieter reality. He had just lost his uncle. Sitting on a shelf in his closet was a physical reminder of that loss. It was a locked metal box, handed to him the day before Michael died. He possessed the means to open it. Written on a piece of paper was a 3-digit combination, 829. Late at night, sitting in the dark with the combination in his hand, the urge to spin the dial and read his uncle's final words was immense. But he had made a promise, a strict vow to Michael himself, to wait exactly 10 years before turning that final number. While the rest of the world moved on to dissecting a pop star's death, Jaafar's life effectively froze around a single, unbreakable, decade-long commitment. By 2012, Jaafar was 16, and he was struggling. He tried to forge his own identity while carrying a last name belonging to music history. The public had expectations. They constantly asked if he'd sing, if he was going to perform, or if he could moonwalk. 2 years later, he began doing small tribute shows. The public reaction was intense. Fans immediately projected their lingering grief and adoration onto him. People praised him by saying he looked and sounded exactly like his uncle. To Jaafar, it felt like being a copy rather than an original. Then, outside a venue one night, a woman approached him in tears. She explained that Michael had secretly paid for her daughter's surgery, saving her life. Jaafar began to grasp the true scale of his uncle's legacy. These invisible threads extended far beyond music and into the lives of total strangers. He went home that night and stared at the box in his closet. Looking for guidance on who he was supposed to be, he resolved to hold out for the remaining 5 years. The locked box had shifted into a silent, necessary compass for his identity. By 2016, 20-year-old Jaafar received a tangible opportunity, a 3-album record contract with a $500,000 advance. He turned the money down. His reasoning was simple. He couldn't ask his uncle if it was the right move yet. His management was in disbelief. To them, relying on a locked box instead of signing a lucrative contract meant he was losing his grip on practical reality. The decision triggered an intervention. His family gathered in his living room, gently urging him to leave the box behind and start his career. They saw a young man throwing away a sure thing. But Jaafar maintained a quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever was locked inside that box might actually be his true future. He checked his internal countdown. He only had to endure 3 more years. The promise demanded more than personal discipline. It required a massive professional sacrifice. By 2018, Jaafar was 22. He was exhausted by the pressure and had nearly given up on performing entirely. 9 years passed. Self-doubt set in. He feared the box might be empty, a feverish mistake of a dying man. The closer to the end, the higher the psychological stakes. Opening an empty box now meant a decade of extreme discipline was wasted. Sitting in his bedroom, he picked up his phone. He found the number for a locksmith. His thumb hovered over the screen, ready to break the lock and finally end the wait. He pulled his finger away. He chose to endure the final year. That decade of waiting forced Jaafar into a state of discipline that few artists his age ever encounter. This waiting period acted as an anchor. It protected him from being prematurely consumed by the machinery of the music industry. In 2019, 10 years after the promise was made, Jaafar finally reached the date he had guarded for half his life. He stood before the box not as a grieving teenager, but as a man who had sacrificed $500,000 to prove his word could not be broken.
So our story really kicks off on June 25, 2019, exactly 10 years to the day after his uncle passed away. Imagine this. Jaafar wakes up at 6 a.m. He's a total mix of anticipation, terror, grief, and hope. He walks over to this dusty metal box he's guarded for a whole decade. The paper with the combination? It's yellowed, completely faded from years of him just handling it. But those numbers were still crystal clear, 829. And with tears welling up, it suddenly hit him, something he hadn't realized for 10 entire years. The combination was August 29th, Michael's birthday. With trembling hands, he dials the numbers and click, the lock finally opens.
Let's trace this journey back a bit. A promise made back in 2009 by an absolute pop legend to a young 13-year-old boy. Over the next 10 years, that boy grew into a man living under the intense, heavy shadow of that exact promise. But you know that decade of waiting? It completely redefined what that box meant, and it perfectly prepared this young man for the morning he'd finally open it.
Part 1. Inside the box, 5 sacred items. Now, when Jaafar lifted that lid, he didn't just find random souvenirs. What he discovered was a carefully preserved collection of artifacts carrying massive weight, both in music history and deep personal memory.
The stuff Michael chose to leave behind was incredibly deliberate. First up, the iconic single white glove from the Motown 25 performance. Yeah, literally the piece of clothing that kicked off the moonwalk and the whole mythology. Next, a worn fedora that actually still carried the faint scent of his signature cologne. Talk about a time machine, instantly transporting Jaafar back to his childhood. Third was a handwritten notebook packed with completely unseen, unreleased lyrics. Wow. Fourth, just a simple USB drive labeled for Jaafar. And lastly, a sealed envelope with strict, handwritten instructions, read this last. Jaafar treated these things like they were absolutely sacred, carefully setting them aside before plugging in that USB drive.
Part 2. A voice from the past. Uncle Mike's message. Plugging in that drive with shaking hands, Jaafar was suddenly hit with a sound he hadn't heard in 10 long years. After a decade of absolute silence, his uncle's voice was just there, in the room, warm, close, and heartbreakingly real.
The 20-minute recording kicked off with this gut-wrenching apology. Michael said, "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. And I'm so sorry, nephew. I'm so sorry I can't be there to see the man you've become." Hearing that, it immediately broke the dam. A decade's worth of tears just poured out of Jaafar.
But then, the audio shifted gears into something honestly startling. The voice memo started addressing Jaafar's highly specific insecurities, his struggles with comparison, his constant doubts about being good enough. So, the really big question here is, how on earth did Michael know? How does a man sitting in a room back in 2009 perfectly predict the exact shape of his nephew's self-doubt, the exact weight of comparison that would be keeping him up at night a full 10 years into the future?
Well, Michael's recorded voice gave him the answer. He told Jaafar, "You're not supposed to be me. You're supposed to be you. Better than me. Stronger than me. Free in ways I never was." Michael explained that the whole reason for the 10-year delay was because he needed Jaafar to just grow up first. He needed him to figure out his own identity without the massive shadow of Michael Jackson hanging over him, without his uncle always telling him what to do. Think about that. He spent 20 minutes projecting his voice into the future, speaking to a version of his nephew that didn't even exist yet.
Part 3. The final envelope. A calling, not just a gift. So with that intensely emotional audio wrapped up, Jaafar followed the very last instruction. He opened that sealed envelope marked, "Read this last." He was probably expecting some more life advice, right? But what he found was actually a massive responsibility. Inside was a handwritten letter, along with a stack of dense legal documents. The letter revealed something incredible: a legally established foundation called the Jaafar Jackson Arts Foundation. Michael wrote that the board had literally been waiting for 10 years. It had just been sitting there, quietly, fully funded, waiting for 23-year-old Jaafar to finally walk through the door and claim his true purpose. And that purpose wasn't to be the next Michael. It was to help others be themselves.
And we're not just talking about a nice, symbolic gesture here. We are talking about a staggering $2 million endowment. $2 million! Michael set this up specifically to help underprivileged kids who dreamed of performing but couldn't afford it. Kids exactly like Michael once was, who just needed someone to believe in their dreams. And Michael was handing Jaafar the power to be that someone.
Part 4. The wisdom of waiting, the aftermath. What happened next took this from a deeply private family moment straight to a global lesson. Jaafar called his mom over to show her the impossible evidence, and later that night, he posted a photo on Instagram, sharing the contents of the box and the 10-year promise with the world.
As you might guess, that post went completely viral. I mean, 10 million likes in 24 hours kind of viral. People everywhere were just captivated by the crazy foresight of Michael's final act. Naturally, this level of attention led to an interview with Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah, being Oprah, asked the defining question that really gets to the core of this whole explainer. Why do you think Michael made you wait 10 years? Jaafar's answer was just stunningly insightful. He basically said that if he had received this immense gift right after his uncle died in 2009, he would have desperately tried to become him. He would have totally lost his own identity trying to fill the impossible shoes of the next Michael Jackson. But the delay, the struggle, the sheer necessity of finding his own path first, it meant that when he finally got this blessing, he was completely ready to receive it as himself, not as a shadow.
Part 5. The greatest gift, a legacy realized. You see, the pain of that 10-year delay forged a young man who was fully capable of leading, and that is exactly what Jaafar has been doing, with unbelievable success, ever since he cracked open that box.
The real-world impact of Michael's foresight is just off the charts. Today, the Jaafar Jackson Arts Foundation is one of the largest youth arts charities in America. In just 4 years, they've helped over 3,000 kids, and they've raised an astounding $15 million. To put that into perspective, that's funding for full performing arts scholarships, instruments, lessons, you name it. Michael Jackson never had a normal childhood, but through this foundation, he and Jaafar are giving thousands of kids the chance to have exactly that, a normal childhood plus a dream.
In literally every single office of the foundation, there's this photograph on the wall. It's a picture of Michael hugging a 13-year-old Jaafar the day before he died, the exact day he handed over that locked box. And right beneath it is a quote that sums up this entire story perfectly. The greatest gift isn't what you give, it's knowing when to give it. So as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a question to chew on. In a world that constantly demands instant gratification, how can we apply this genius lesson of patience to the gifts, the support, and the guidance we give to the people we love? Because sometimes the absolute most powerful thing we can give someone is simply the time they need to become who they're meant